Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel General Hospital today. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Britt Westbourne had always lived with secrets, lies and shadows following her every move. Being the daughter of Caesar Faison and Liesel Albrecht meant that deception was practically in her bloodline. But despite her troubled past, Britt had tried in her own way to evolve into something better. She wanted more than to be dismissed as the Britt who schemed her way through relationships and career moves. She had come back to Port Charles searching for stability, family, and maybe even love, but she never imagined that one of the biggest lies she would ever uncover was tied directly to the man everyone believed to be her half-brother, Nathan West. Nathan had been introduced into her life as the respectable, heroic cop, the kind of man who could redeem the very tainted blood they both shared. Britt had held on to that connection, sometimes with skepticism, but still there was comfort in the idea of family. What she didn't know was that the very foundation of that bond was about to collapse. For months, Britt had felt little inconsistencies in Nathan's words and actions, things she shrugged off as differences in personality or perhaps her own paranoia. She told herself that Nathan was honest, that he was a good man who only wanted to do the right thing. Yet, somewhere in the back of her mind, questions festered. How had Nathan appeared out of nowhere so cleanly tied into their chaotic family story? How had he managed to stay unsullied by the poisonous influence of Faison and Albrecht when Britt herself had been marked so deeply? She doubted but silenced herself, unwilling to alienate one of the only steady connections she had. But the truth has a way of surfacing, and in this case, it came in a shocking unmasking that Britt could neither control nor ignore. It began on an ordinary day, the kind of day that seemed too calm for Port Charles. Britt had arranged to meet Nathan at her apartment, wanting to clear the air about her own struggles. She wanted him to understand her better, perhaps even forgive her lingering mistakes. But when Nathan arrived, his composure felt off. He wasn't the steady brother she knew. He was nervous, distracted, and unable to meet her eyes. Britt's instincts, sharpened by years of surviving lies, immediately detected that something was very wrong. She pressed him gently at first, then more firmly when he deflected. He tried to dismiss her, but his excuses didn't match his demeanor. And then she noticed something she hadn't before. A slip of paper falling from his jacket pocket, one she scooped up before he could snatch it away. The paper wasn't just a receipt or a note. It was a document, half shredded but still legible enough for Britt to catch the gist. It contained details about an alias, a background that didn't belong to Nathan West, but to someone else entirely. Heart-pounding, Britt demanded an explanation. Nathan froze, and in that silence, the weight of the truth pressed in. For the first time since she had met him, Nathan's mask cracked. His voice, usually so firm, trembled as he tried to fabricate a cover story. But Britt had seen enough lies in her lifetime to recognize one unraveling before her eyes. The confrontation escalated quickly. Britt accused him of being someone else, of hiding something monumental. He begged her to let it go, claiming it was about protection, about things she didn't understand. But Britt wouldn't relent. She tore into his carefully constructed persona until finally, in a heated moment of desperation, Nathan admitted the truth. He wasn't Nathan West, not the brother she had been told was hers, not the clean-cut detective who had stood by her. He was an imposter, living under a fabricated identity, using a name and a life that wasn't his own. The room seemed to spin as Britt processed his words. Every memory they shared, every conversation they had about family, every assurance he had given her. All of it crumbled into dust. She staggered back, clutching the edge of the couch for balance, her mind reeling with betrayal. Her so-called brother wasn't her brother at all. He wasn't even Nathan. He was a stranger who had wormed his way into her world under the guise of kinship. The anger that surged in her was matched only by a deep ache of loss, because in her own fragile way, Britt had cared for him, had trusted him. Now that trust had been shattered beyond repair. Nathan, or whoever he was, pleaded with her not to expose him, to hear him out. He claimed his deception had been necessary, that powerful enemies were involved, that the truth could put lives at risk. But Britt couldn't think past the betrayal. She heard only echoes of every other lie that had shaped her life, every other manipulation her parents had orchestrated. Was this imposter just another extension of their twisted games? Or was he something more dangerous? She didn't know, but she was determined to find out. As the argument wore on, Britt's fury gave way to a cold determination. She demanded full disclosure, demanded to know who he really was, what his motives were, and why he had chosen to live a lie that involved her so deeply. He hesitated, torn between survival and confession, but Britt's piercing gaze left no room for escape. She pressed, her voice sharp, until he finally uttered a name that wasn't Nathan West. That moment confirmed it. Everything she believed about her family ties had been nothing more than a cruel performance, and she was once again left holding the wreckage of someone else's deceit. Yet, in the pit of her stomach, Britt knew this wasn't just a personal betrayal. The scope felt bigger, more dangerous. Whoever this man was, whatever his reasons, the deception hinted at a network of secrets that could shake Port Charles to its core. And Britt, despite her pain, wasn't about to walk away. If Nathan was fake, she needed to know who had orchestrated it, and most importantly, why. Britt stood frozen after the name slipped from his lips, the one that erased Nathan West, as though he had never existed. The silence that followed felt suffocating, broken only by the sound of her own uneven breathing. She replayed every moment of their so-called sibling bond, every heartfelt exchange, and felt as though she had been living in an elaborate performance designed to manipulate her. The imposter's face carried regret, even shame, but it did nothing to soothe the storm raging inside her. She had been fooled once again, and the bitter taste of betrayal was something she knew all too well. She forced herself to speak, her voice cutting like glass. "You're going to tell me everything right now? Who sent you? Why pretend to be my brother? And don't you dare feed me another half-truth." Her eyes blazed with the mix of fury and heartbreak that only Britt Westbourne could carry, and it was clear she would not be dismissed. He tried to speak gently, almost pleading, but she could see his hands trembling. For a man who had spent years hiding in plain sight, his defenses were crumbling faster than she could have predicted. He confessed that he had been recruited, placed into the identity of Nathan West for reasons tied to protection and control. He admitted that his presence in Port Charles had not been coincidence, nor had it been motivated by a genuine desire for family. He was there because someone powerful had orchestrated the lie, and he was too entangled to escape. Britt listened, disgusted yet unable to stop herself from demanding more. Every word felt like another stab wound, confirming her darkest suspicions that her entire life was little more than a chessboard for people in power. When he mentioned Liesl Albrecht, Britt's rage flared hotter. Her mother's influence, once again poisoning every corner of her existence. Liesl had been the master of manipulation for decades, and Britt had tried to distance herself from that web. But the revelation that Liesl might have had a hand in placing a false brother into her life was more than she could bear. She wanted to scream, to hurl something across the room, but instead, she clenched her fists and demanded details. The imposter admitted that Albrecht had been part of the deception, but not the only one. There were other names, shadowy figures Britt hadn't yet encountered, who had insisted this identity swap was necessary. The why was still unclear, but Britt wasn't going to stop until she had it. Her anger quickly shifted into strategy. Britt wasn't just the daughter of villains. She had inherited their cunning, even if she often hated that side of herself. She knew how to extract information, how to play her own game of survival. She leaned into him, lowering her voice, warning that if he didn't start talking in full, she would march directly to the police, to Maxie, to anyone who would listen. That threat landed hard. His face went pale, his eyes darting toward the door as though escape could erase the mess he'd created. He tried again to appeal to her sense of loyalty, saying, "I didn't want to hurt you. You were innocent in all of this." But Britt laughed bitterly at that. Innocent. She had been raised by Liesl Albrecht and Faison, entangled in crimes, betrayals, and heartbreaks since she was a child. Innocence was something stolen from her long ago. What she wanted now was the truth, because the truth at least gave her power. After nearly an hour of heated back and forth, she began to piece together fragments. He wasn't some random imposter. He had ties to other forces in Port Charles, connections that hinted at larger schemes involving WSB, Faison's legacy, and perhaps even Valentine Cassidy's shadows. Every revelation widened the circle of danger. If Nathan was fake, then every bond he had formed in town, especially with Maxie Jones, was built on lies. Britt's stomach twisted at the thought of Maxie, who had loved Nathan fiercely and who had trusted him with her heart. The betrayal wasn't just hers, it was Maxie's too. And that, perhaps more than anything, fueled Britt's determination. She wasn't going to let her so-called brother continue his charade at the expense of people she cared about. But the imposter was clever in his own way. He insisted that if Britt exposed him too soon, the backlash could be catastrophic. "You don't understand who's behind this," he warned. "If you unravel this the wrong way, people will die." The words hit hard, but Britt's instinct was to distrust. She had been manipulated with fear tactics before. Still, a part of her hesitated. What if this wasn't just another selfish game? What if, this time, the stakes really were higher than personal betrayal? That night, after he left her apartment, Britt stayed awake replaying every detail. Her chest ached from the betrayal, but her mind burned with questions. Was this man a pawn, or was he more deeply complicit than he admitted? What was Liesel's role? Was her mother protecting someone, or simply orchestrating chaos for her own gain? And why had the imposter been allowed to step into the identity of Nathan West at all? She couldn't reconcile the reasons, but she knew one thing. She would not be manipulated again. If the truth was dangerous, then so be it. She would face it head-on. By morning, Britt had a plan. She wasn't going to run to the police, not yet. She needed leverage, information, something that would give her control before she exposed him. That meant digging deeper, and Britt knew exactly where to start. She would confront Liesel directly. If her mother had orchestrated this, Britt wanted to hear it from her lips. And if Liesel tried to dance around the truth, Britt was ready to push harder than ever before. But Britt also realized she couldn't do this alone. As much as she had kept people at arm's length, she would need allies, people she could trust, or at least people with a vested interest in the truth. Maxie came to mind first, though the thought of breaking Maxie's heart with the revelation felt cruel. Still, Maxie deserved to know. Britt also considered approaching Anna Devane, though their relationship was far from warm. Anna's connection to the WSB and history with Faison meant she might already have pieces of the puzzle. And if anyone had the means to dismantle a dangerous cover-up, it was Anna. The days ahead loomed like a storm, and Britt felt both terrified and electrified. She was standing at the edge of an abyss, about to uncover a conspiracy that stretched far beyond her personal life. The imposter's revelation had been the spark, but Britt knew the fire was just beginning. The air in General Hospital was always a specific kind of stale, a sterile cocktail of antiseptic, floor wax, and simmering human drama. For Dr. Britt Westbourne, it was the scent of home, or as close to one as she'd ever known. Today, however, it felt suffocating. She stood at the nurse's station on the neurology floor, her fingers drumming a restless, silent rhythm on the laminated countertop. Her eyes were fixed on the door to one of the private rooms, a door that had become both a sanctuary and a prison. Behind that door was Nathan West, her Nathan. Or so she had believed for the past 3 months. 3 months. It felt like both a lifetime and the blink of an eye. It had begun with the miracle. Nathan, her beloved, who had been taken from her in a tragic accident, a man she had mourned with a grief so profound it had hollowed her out, had walked back into her life. He'd been found disoriented and injured in a town 2 states away, a victim of a hit-and-run with partial amnesia. The authorities, after piecing together his identification, had delivered him back to Port Charles, back to her. The reunion had been a public spectacle of tears and joy. Britt, the often cynical, guarded daughter of the notorious Caesar Faison, had wept openly in the hospital lobby, clinging to the solid, familiar form of the man she thought she'd lost forever. He looked like Nathan. He had the same shock of dark hair, the same gentle blue eyes, the same scar above his right eyebrow from a childhood tumble. He even smelled like Nathan, that faint, comforting mix of soap and fresh air. But from the very first day, a tiny, insidious seed of doubt had been planted in the fertile soil of Britt's mind. It wasn't anything she could articulate, not at first. It was a feeling, a dissonance so subtle it was almost imperceptible. She had chalked it up to the amnesia, to the trauma he had endured. Of course he was different. How could he not be? She called him Nate, a private nickname she'd used. He'd smiled a perfect, warm smile and said, "It's good to be home, Britt." But the smile hadn't quite reached his eyes. Nathan's smiles had always been a little lopsided, his left eye crinkling more than his right. This man's smile was symmetrical, practiced. The differences were a collection of minor notes that began to form a disturbing chord. Nathan had been a detective with the Port Charles Police Department, a man of action with a straightforward, almost simplistic palate. He loved cheap beer, greasy burgers, and would never ever touch sushi. A week after his return, Britt had ordered from his favorite Japanese place, wanting to celebrate. He'd picked at the salmon roll, his distaste poorly concealed before he claimed his stomach was still settling. Then there was the music. Nathan's taste had been unapologetically stuck in the 80s rock era. Bon Jovi, Def Leppard, the soundtrack to their early happy days. One evening, Britt had put on Livin' on a Prayer, watching him for a reaction. He had hummed along absently, but his fingers, tapping on the arm of the sofa, had been completely out of sync with the beat. It was a small thing, a meaningless thing, but it sent a cold trickle down her spine. The most significant change was in his physicality. Nathan had been a brawler, a man whose strength was raw and untamed. This Nathan moved with a different kind of grace, a controlled, almost fluid precision. During a physical therapy session Britt had observed, he'd executed a series of stretches with the balletic control of a dancer or a martial artist, not the powerful, sometimes clumsy movements of her former detective. She had voiced her concerns tentatively to a few close friends. "It's the amnesia, Britt," they'd all said, their voices dripping with sympathetic condescension. "You have to be patient. The brain is a mysterious thing. He's been through hell." Even the brilliant Dr. Finn, her colleague, had agreed. The psychological trauma of an accident, combined with physical injury, could rewire personality traits, even alter tastes and habits. Britt wanted to believe them. She desperately wanted to believe that her love had been returned to her, that the universe had granted her a second chance. She buried her doubts, smothering them with forced affection and a performance of domestic bliss. She cooked his favorite meals, or what she thought were his favorites. She recounted stories of their past, watching his face for a flicker of genuine recognition. He would listen, nod, and offer a perfectly reasonable, amnesia-fueled explanation for his lack of memory. "It's like reading a book about someone else's life," he'd say, his voice a perfect mimic of Nathan's gentle baritone. "But with you, Britt, I feel like I'm starting to remember what it felt like to be happy." The words were right, but the music was wrong. The breaking point, the moment the seed of doubt sprouted into a full-grown, choking vine, happened 2 days ago. Nathan had been complaining of persistent headaches, a residual effect of his head injury. Britt, ever the doctor, had been monitoring him closely. She'd gone to fetch him a glass of water, and when she returned, she found him staring out the window, his posture rigid, his face a mask of cold, calculating fury. It was an expression she had never seen on Nathan's face. It was an expression that belonged in her world, the world of Faisans and Cassidines, a look of predatory intensity. He must have felt her gaze because he turned, and the mask instantly slipped back into place, replaced by the gentle, slightly confused demeanor she had come to know. "Just thinking," he'd said softly. "It's all so fuzzy." That was the moment Britt Westbourne, the daughter of a master manipulator, stopped being a grieving girlfriend and started being an investigator. The cold, clinical part of her mind, the part she'd inherited from her father, took over. Love was a vulnerability. Doubt was a weapon. And so she began to watch. Not as a lover, but as a scientist observing a specimen. She started with the small things. She deliberately used slang terms Nathan had hated. This Nathan didn't react. She misremembered details of their first date. He corrected her with a smooth, confident accuracy that was at odds with his supposed memory loss. He was learning, she realized. He was studying her reactions, refining his performance based on her cues. Her mind raced through the possibilities. A look-alike. Plastic surgery had come a long way, but this was perfection. The scar, the moles, the slight crook in his nose from an old break, it was all there. A twin? Nathan had no siblings. A clone? That was science fiction, even for Port Charles. No, this was something else. This was a plan, meticulously crafted and executed with chilling precision. The question was, why? Who would go to such lengths, and for what purpose? Was it about her? Her inheritance? Her connection to the Cassadines? Or was it about Nathan himself? What secrets had he been involved with that would warrant such an elaborate scheme? Her investigation led her to the hospital's administrative archives. If this was an imposter, he would have a medical history, records from the out-of-town hospital where he'd been treated. Using her credentials, she accessed the interfacility transfer files. The documents were there, perfectly in order. Admission reports, MRI scans, physicians' notes detailing the amnesia and physical trauma. It was a masterpiece of forgery. But forgeries, no matter how perfect, always had a source.